This is Doug Maitland, Manager of the Acquisition Services Section, Office of Real Estate for the Ohio Department of Transportation. This module is going to be resources for the Value Analysis Report, which includes where we can find laws, regulations, procedures, plans, and instruments. A person preparing the Value Analysis Report must be aware and competent in those things necessary for its completion. This includes an understanding of the federal regulations affecting the Value Analysis Report and where to find these regulations should you need to reference them. An understanding of the state of Ohio regulations affecting the Value Analysis Report and where do you find those. And an understanding of the valuation procedures for the Value Analysis Report and where to find those procedures. You need a competent understanding of highway plans, including the right-of-way component, cross sections, the plan and profile, and the summary sheets. Then you've got to have the ability to interpret those plans to determine the whole property and the effect of the taking on the residue property, that which is left of the whole after the taking. You need a competent understanding of the property rights taken and the rights that remain with the residue property, and to do this you also have to understand ODOT's instruments. And then you're going to use this information to determine what the whole is, determine the highest and best use of that whole, to understand what the taking is legally, physically doing to the property, and determine the impact of the taking on the residue property. With this information, someone can make a competent determination that the valuation problem caused by the taking is simplistic or complex. Obviously, a simplistic taking, we can use the waiver of appraisal, the value analysis. If it's complex, we cannot. All right, let's start with the federal regulations affecting the value analysis. Without federal regulations, there is no value analysis report, so we're going to start here. Federal influences to the state of Ohio highway projects are tied to the funding sources used to develop highway transportation projects. State and LPA highway projects often use federal highway trust funds somewhere in the project. These federal highway trust funds come from federal taxes on fuel used by vehicles. These taxes are deposited into the Highway Trust Fund and are allocated to the states and territories of the United States. FHWA administers the Highway Trust Fund, which is also known as Title 23 grant funds. When ODOT uses these highway trust funds, the project becomes a federal aid project and it must comply with the regulations attached to those funds. This means if there's any highway trust funds in any part of the project, the entire project becomes federalized and all aspects of the project must comply with federal regulations. The federal regulations affecting real estate acquisition are 23 CFR Part 710, 23 CFR 635.309, the Uniform Act, and 49 CFR Part 24. ODOT is accountable to FHWA to ensure that ODOT, its LPAs, its contractors, and project partners comply with federal regulations. The federal regulation that is the basis for the ODOT Value Analysis Report is 49 CFR Part 24, and particularly 24.102C. And right now you are looking at that code. Before the initiation of negotiations, the real property to be acquired shall be appraised, except as provided in 24.102C2. An appraisal is not required if the agency determines that an appraisal is unnecessary because the valuation problem is uncomplicated and the anticipated value of the proposed acquisition is estimated at $10,000 or less based on a review of available data. When an appraisal is determined to be unnecessary, the agency shall prepare a waiver valuation, and the person performing that waiver valuation must have sufficient understanding of the local real estate market to be qualified to make the waiver valuation. This federal regulation is supplemented by Appendix A to 49 CFR Part 24. And from the appendix, the purpose of the appraisal waiver provision is to provide agencies a technique to avoid the cost and time delay associated with appraisal requirements for low-value, non-complex acquisitions. The agency employee making the determination to use the waiver valuation process must have enough understanding of appraisal principles to be able to determine whether or not the proposed acquisition is low value and uncomplicated. Waiver valuations are not appraisals as defined by the Uniform Act and these regulations. Therefore, appraisal performance requirements or standards, regardless of their source, are not required for waiver valuations by this rule. Since waiver valuations are not appraisals, neither is there a requirement for an appraisal review. However, the agency must have a reasonable basis for the waiver valuation, and an agency official must still establish an amount believed to be just compensation. The definition of appraisal in the Uniform Act and the appraisal waiver provision of the Uniform Act and these regulations are federal law and public policy. All right, so that's the federal code. Here's the state of Ohio regulations. Let's see if these regulations are different than the federal regulations. All right, state regulation is Ohio Administrative Code. It's 5501 2-506 Rule B3. And there is that rule. So what I've just with a red rectangle, that information is the exact same as the federal regulation. What we're looking at now is not in the federal regulation. And it says, when an appraisal is determined to be unnecessary, the agency shall prepare a waiver valuation. Persons preparing or reviewing a waiver valuation are precluded from complying with standards 1, 2, 3, and 4 of USPAP. That part is different. And just a short explanation here. Often those that do waiver valuations for the Ohio Department of Transportation are certified appraisers. Certified appraisers have that certification from the Ohio Department of Commerce Division of Real Estate. Certified appraisers are required by their certification to comply with Ohio Revised Code 4763. That section of the code requires certified appraisers to comply with USPAP when doing any appraisal-related function. And the waiver valuation is an appraisal-related function. So the certified appraiser is in a quandary. The Uniform Act and ODOT procedures say it's not an appraisal, you don't have to comply with USPAP, but their certification requires them to comply with USPAP. So it is possible for somebody who is certified to do an appraisal waiver for ODOT, comply with the standards, comply with the federal rules, but still be subject to disciplinary action from the Department of Commerce because they didn't comply with USPAP. So what ODOT did is it invoked the jurisdictional exception rule in USPAP, put it into the Ohio Administrative Code, so therefore this section of the code precludes the appraiser from complying with USPAP under certain conditions. And so long as the certified appraisers invokes jurisdictional exception correctly, they should be safe from disciplinary action from the Division of Real Estate for putting forth an appraisal-related function that doesn't comply with USPAP. All right, continuing. The last part of the code also is the same as the federal code. So for all intents and purposes, the state code and federal code are very nearly the same. All right, quick review of the regulatory requirements for the VA, the waiver valuation. Need some kind of agency assessment is required to determine that the valuation problem is uncomplicated and the anticipated compensation is less than $10,000. And if these conditions occur, ODOT may waive the appraisal and do a waiver valuation. The form ODOT uses to implement the appraisal waiver regulation is the Value Analysis Report. And people making the determination that the valuation problem is simplistic and uncomplicated and less than $10,000 must understand the appraisal process with enough competency to make these judgment calls. Waiver valuations are not appraisals. Appraisal standards don't apply. There's no requirement for a review. Persons preparing the waiver are precluded from complying with USPAP standards rules 1 through 4, so long as they invoke jurisdictional exception correctly. The person preparing the waiver must understand the local real estate market. And so now it's time for a knowledge check.